Um, it's a great privilege to be here at this conference and have the opportunity to hear the stories of so many women who have dedicated their lives to the great struggle on behalf of women. Each story, in a sense, is very particular and unique, and yet, in a sense, each story is also the story of a group of people. And so there's that universal aspect of it. And since yesterday, as I have heard a lot of these stories, and some of these women whose stories were being narrated are very dear to me personally, I have been able to connect with these stories in many ways, and yet I have felt in some ways very alone, because a very deep shadow hangs over the world that is my world, and the situation of the Muslims in the world, what has happened, what is happening since 9/11, the polarization of the world into two opposite camps, us versus them, good versus evil, and we all know who is supposed to be good and who is supposed to be evil. I feel that given the importance of understanding the world of Islam, which includes more than 500 million women, is paramount today. And therefore, given the importance of that context, I feel that Muslim women are terribly underrepresented at this conference, because there are only two of us, and my colleague, Aziza Al-Hibri, whose story was very interesting, has had a very different kind of life from mine, but I feel that a lot more attention should have been given to understanding what is happening to Muslim women today. And the struggle that I've been having since yesterday is, what shall I talk about? Shall I talk about my theology, or shall I talk about my struggle from childhood onwards, or shall I talk about what we are going through since 9/11, or what? I don't know, and I don't know how I can do any of it within 20 minutes anyway. So I will try to do whatever I can. About a decade ago, I wrote an autobiographical piece that was published in a book. It was called Jihad fi Sabilillah, which means struggle in the name of God, or for the sake of God, a Muslim woman's faith's journey from struggle to struggle to struggle. And I think what I would like to do first today is to talk to you a little bit about the struggles of my life as a Muslim girl and as a Muslim woman. I come from a Sayyid Muslim family, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, from Lahore, a historic Muslim city, from Pakistan, a country, the only country in the world created in the name of Islam, so there can hardly be any doubt about my Muslim identity. When I look back on my life and ask myself, at what time did I become a feminist in any sense of the word, I can't even put a date on it, because I was born into a family which was very exceptional in a sense. Both my parents came from very old families and eminent families, but they were very, very different. My father was a very conservative, very kindly person, but came from a very conservative background. And my mother came from a line of poets, artists, creative people, just crazy people generally. They were married. My mother was 16, my father was 32. They never agreed on anything. They had 9 children, of whom 4 were daughters and 5 were boys. The most bitter struggle that my parents had, they, as I said, they never agreed on anything, but the most intense struggle that they had was on how to bring up the daughters. Because my father believed that girls should be married at 16 to whoever was picked out for them, and this was best for them. And this is what happened to my 2 older sisters. And my mother fought this with all the passion that she was capable of, but she didn't succeed with my 2 sisters. And I was the 3rd daughter. And when I was 12, my sister was 16, I saw her being married and I saw her being sacrificed in the name of family honor, tradition, etc. Until that time, I had been a very quiet child, and I think that the way I survived the intense hostility and conflict in my home was by withdrawing into an inner world of imagination. You know, my grandfather had been a very well-known poet, and so was my mother, and I spent a lot of my childhood reading, writing. I used to write a lot of poetry, and so on. I lived in my inner world. I was a very gentle child, and so on. And then at 12, I saw what happened to my sister. And then I realized that the same thing was going to happen. The same drama was going to be reenacted 4 years later with me as the victim. And at that, that was a moment when my entire life changed, because I realized that now I would have to fend for myself. And so I asked myself, now what am I going to do? How do I fight this battle? And I said to myself, okay, what I do from now on is any time my father asks me to do anything, I have to say no. I was only 12, and I could only think with the mind of a 12-year-old. So I started to do that, and all of a sudden, you know, this very quiet, gentle child becomes, you know, this very rebellious person overnight. And, you know, I don't want you to think I was doing anything wild, because I wasn't. But, for instance, the first major battle I got into with my father was I used to study in a co-educational school, Anglican missionary school, with my three younger brothers. And then at that point, I was supposed to be taken out of the school and put in a Catholic convent. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. If you take me out, I'm going to stop studying. Of course, you know, it was a bluff, and I think if anybody had called me on it, I couldn't have carried it through. But anyhow, this struggle went on for many years. I did continue in that school, but every day for years and years, until at the age of 17, I went to England. I kind of ran away from home. This conflict went on. I wish, again, if I had a lot of time to talk to you about what that was all like. But that was, you know, my life undoubtedly was very much shaped by what happened to me in my childhood. And then I was very strongly supported by my mother. My mother was an ultra-radical feminist with very little formal education, but an extremely intelligent woman. And, you know, I was the person that she was training to win the Derby. You know, I was the most focused of her children. And so in a way, you know, she trained me in a particular way. She did not allow me to have any moment of weakness in any kind of way, and so on. Later on, I mean, again, I wish I had more time to talk to you about this whole story, but as my life went on, I mean, the two women who had, of course, the greatest impact on my life, one was my mother, and the second is my most beloved daughter. And I don't know if I have time to talk about her either, but in terms of my mother, you know, it was very interesting because so much of what I am is because of my mother. And yet, she was the person with whom I had the most intense conflict in my life. Because my mother was a Nietzschean. She believed in will to power. And she believed in me being a superwoman, and I didn't turn out to be one in the way that she defined the term. Because from childhood onwards, I was a person with a very strong commitment to justice. And I fought my mother always, because my mother was, in some ways, an extremely unjust woman, who had favorites amongst her children, and, you know, who tyrannized over the servants, and so on and so on. And my mother affectionately always called me the leader of the opposition. Anyway, that's when the story started. I was asked to talk about the highlights of my life. There are just so many that, you know, you need to invite me back sometime to talk to you more. I want to, you know, this, I mean, I was living this struggle, but perhaps not at a conscious level in the sense of, you know, thinking about it in theological terms. I want to take you to 1974, when I was teaching at Oklahoma State University at a place called Stillwater, which kind of lives up to its name. At this university, there was a chapter of an organization in North America called the Muslim Students Association. It has chapters all over the place, and there was a chapter there. And this university had a rule that every student chapter had to have a faculty advisor. And that year, I was the only Muslim faculty member on campus, and so I became the advisor. Now, this group consisted entirely of Arab men, mostly from the Gulf area, which is the most conservative part of the Islamic world. And this group was so patriarchal in its attitude that not only did they not have any women in their membership, but they did not allow any women even to be in the audience. So you can imagine how thrilled they were to have me as their faculty advisor. In the fall of every year, they had a tradition that they would have their annual seminar, and it was customary for the faculty member to say a few words about whatever was the theme of the seminar. But in my case, I was asked by these students to speak about women in Islam, the role of women in Islam. Now, that was not the topic of the seminar, but in the eyes of these men, what else was I qualified to talk about, even though I taught them Islamic studies, you know? Now, I had not been very interested in that subject until that time. And I was a bit affronted by the insinuation that was underlying this invitation. I did understand that. But I accepted the invitation for two reasons. And the two reasons were as follows. First, I had come across so many hundreds of writings, books, brochures, articles on the subject of role and position and status of women in Islam, all of them by Muslim men. To date, I have never come across any writing on the role or status or position of man in Islam, which makes me think that perhaps he has none. And you know, we should... So I thought maybe, anyhow, perhaps it is time for a Muslim woman to look at this issue. The other one was that this group of men believed sincerely that hearing the voice of a woman who was not related to them would put their soul in jeopardy. And, we all know about mortal sins, etc. So this was a mortal sin. So I said, well, at least they'll have to hear my voice. So it's good. Let me talk to them. Anyhow, for these kind of mixed motives, I started the study. Now, I knew exactly what they wanted me to talk about. They wanted me to talk about what does a good Muslim woman do as a wife, as a mother, etc. And that was not what I was going to talk about. But what was I going to talk about? Now, I have always used the Quran as a textbook in the courses I teach on Islam. So I said, well, maybe I should do a systematic study of what the Quran says about women. I had read it many times, but not with that particular focus. So I started to do that. And I think that was, in a sense, the start of this journey. What I realized very early on was two things. One is, and both these things made me very, very angry. One was I realized the gap that exists, the profound gap, discrepancy that exists between what the Quran, which Muslims believe to be God's word, about what the Quran says about women's rights and what is actually happening to women in Muslim societies. And the second thing I realized is how many things had happened to me personally, because I had been born a female in a Muslim home. I had not ever made that connection before. And so I began my study in 1974. And I continued it for about 9 or 10 years. And the primary motivation for doing this study was to make sense of my own life as a Muslim woman. It was a very, very private study, very personal, based in very deep existential need. But I have to tell you that enlightenment does not always lead to endless bliss. And the more I got into this study, the more angry and anguished I became seeing the reality on the ground. Now, I left Pakistan in 1974. That was my hijrah, my immigration to this country. But I have always had a home in Lahore, and I have always kept a very close contact with the land of my origin and would spend virtually every summer there. Now, in the mid-70s, a process got underway generally following the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And this process has been called, at least in Pakistan, it was called Islamization. It has been called by many different names. Most recently in Afghanistan, in its most extreme and perverted form, it was called Talibanization. Anyhow, this process got underway. Now, what is this process? And this, of course, process has shaped what has happened in the Muslim world since that time. What, simply stated, the Islamization process is the initiation or the promulgation by the governments of Muslim countries of laws that are designed to make these countries more Muslim. Now, they're Muslim to begin with, but the assumption is they're not Muslim enough, and therefore they need these laws. If you look at the content of these laws, you find that virtually all of them target women. And the second point of emphasis is that they institute Islamic punishments, but most of the time the punishment is inflicted on Muslim women. So the question then obviously arises, why is it and how is it that in these countries where you have so many problems of massive political corruption, economic mismanagement, and a host of other sociological issues, why is there this obsession with women? There's no simple answer to that question, but there are 2 points I think that one should consider in trying to understand this motivation underlying Islamization. One is that modern Muslims are greatly challenged by modernity. And they understand modernity in 2 different senses. One is they understand it as modernization, which is equated with science and technology, better standard of life, better healthcare, etc. I don't know anybody who's against that. The second, however, is what is called westernization. The first association of westernization in Muslim minds is with colonialism, with the experience of being colonized, which was a very harsh experience. And everything from latchkey kids to community breakup, family breakup, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, etc., is associated with westernization. What is of interest to observe here is that if one asks an average Muslim what is to name a symbol of westernization that is particularly disturbing, what you hear is that it is an emancipated Muslim woman. She's never seen as modernized, always seen as westernized. The second thing is that in traditional societies, and there are many other traditional societies also beside the Muslim, the world is seen in terms of 2 kinds of spaces. There's what is called private space and what is called public space. Private space is the home, and this is where women belong, and public space is the rest of the world, and this belongs to men. The 2 are obviously very unequal. There is an invisible curtain, a barrier that separates these 2 kinds of spaces. In Arabic, the word is hijab, which actually has been used now more and more for the dress that women wear, the head to foot cover. So ideally speaking, then, one should live in a segregated world where men and women simply inhabit different compartments, and there should be no crossing over of this invisible boundary. However, if a woman, for reason of just becoming totally destitute or dependent, there's no male person left to take care of her, has to cross this barrier, has to enter into public space, then she should be dressed in such a way and act in such a way that though she is there, she is not really there. She is nameless and faceless and voiceless. Now, the question then arises, so what I argue in my work is that what is called segregation and what is called veiling is in fact the same thing. It's just it's a different form of, veiling is a different form of segregation. Now, the question that again arises, interesting question, is why? Why should women not be in public space? The answer, there are very many interesting answers, all the way from St. Augustine, whom we all know was not a great friend, or perhaps too great a friend of women, I don't know which way you look at it, and to Maulana Maududi, who's a very conservative Muslim thinker, who has had, again, very, very negative attitude toward women. The answer is the same. In different words, in the words of St. Augustine, he did not allow women to intrude into public space because, quote unquote, women cause erections even in holy men. That's the problem. One should say, well, shouldn't that be considered a male problem? I mean, shouldn't they be doing something about it? But the burden of maintaining public morality, unfortunately, has always rested on women. So that's the thing. Now, again, okay, so this Islamization process had started in Pakistan in the 70s. And law after law after law was being passed, which was very, very obviously anti-women laws. In the summer of I happened to spend two entire years in Pakistan in 83 and 84. I was on sabbatical and I had a year's fellowship, so this was the longest single stay for me in Pakistan in a long time. And at this point, this Islamization process was at its height. And I was approached in the summer of 1984 by my activist friends who knew about my research, that I had been working and doing this work for 10 years, sort of reinterpreting the Quranic text from a non-patriarchal perspective, came to me and said, we need your help because this law after law is being passed in the name of Islam. We don't know what to do about it. We don't have the training. You're the only Muslim woman that we know who works in this area. So you need to come up with some sort of an Islamic ideology or some sort of a feminist strategy how we can fight these laws. And I want to make an important point here, and the point is that since the 70s, in any Islamic country, when a law has been passed in the name of Islam, it has never been reversed. There's not any case of it being reversed, despite political action, which makes it quite clear that political action, though important, is not sufficient. It hasn't brought about any change. And so I saw this very early on, that the challenge has to come from within Islam. So I started to work on it, and it led me to a very, very interesting phase in my own development as a theologian. And I identified, because I have also since the mid-70s been very much involved in interreligious dialogue with Christians and Jews and other Muslims. And I began to see certain patterns, and I developed, I identified what I call the three foundational theological assumptions that underlie the idea that men are superior to women and women are inferior to men. Because it's regarded as self-evident in all Muslim societies and communities that men are superior to women and women are inferior to men. The men believe it, the women believe it, and so there is no difficulty about institutionalizing these laws. But where did this belief come from? That was the idea that I was investigating. And then I identified these three assumptions. Now, these three assumptions were that, or are that, God's primary creation was Adam. Adam was a male person, and from the rib of this male person, God created a female person who is therefore secondary and derivative and subordinate. This is the issue of woman's creation, and I have done a lot of work on it, written a book on it, in fact. The second assumption was that though she was secondary in creation, she was primary in guilt because she got poor Adam thrown out of paradise. We all know that story. That's called the fall of man, and a whole baggage of feminine evil is attached to that. And the third assumption is not only was she created from Adam, but she was created for Adam to be a helpmate unto him. Therefore, he is fundamental and she is instrumental. And, so anyhow, this is, if I had a lot more time, I would like to talk about it, but not now. So I started to do this work because I wanted to get to the bottom of this inequality that exists between men and women in Muslim societies, and how were we going to fight this. So that was happening, and on the other hand, the fights in the streets were going on. The country, Pakistan, was under martial law. It has been under martial law for most of its life, and these friends of mine who were activists were being punished severely, beaten, lathi charge, put in jail, etc. So this was going on at the same time. Anyhow, that was the time when I began to realize the importance of taking the theological work that I had done and translating it into something practical, doing something, building actually projects, programs, which could be used for the empowerment of women. And I became involved in this process then in that year. That was 1983, 84, 2 years actually. And then in 85, 86, I came to the Harvard Divinity School. That was my year here. And that was an extremely difficult time for me, especially coming from where I had come from. Women's studies in religion was at that point perhaps very different from what it is today, but initially when I came, I felt like I saw the Harvard Divinity School, this women's studies program, as an oasis, as a green place in something that seemed like a desert to me. I say sometimes, sort of half jokingly, I have only known two places in the world that are totally segregated, Saudi Arabia and the Harvard Divinity School. Because women lived in a totally different world from men. Now, in this women's group, I found a lot of support in the beginning, because as long as they saw me as a deviant within the Islamic tradition, as a rebel, they were very supportive of me. But the moment we started talking theology and they realized that I wanted to do my theological work in the context of Islam, that I wanted to work from within the faith perspective, I encountered the worst hostility I have ever encountered in my life. And I think my sole friend in that program was Carol, who's sitting here, and I've shared a lot of these things with her. This was a very, very difficult year for me because, again, coming out of already a very intense struggle, and then here, I encountered these women who were brilliant scholars of religion, and yet most of them profoundly irreligious, who could not understand what it meant to be religious, who could not at all have any sympathy for the fact that I regarded the Quran as a sacred book and wanted to work from within the faith perspective. I felt, in a sense, for the whole year that I was nailed on the cross, to use a Christian symbol, and every single belief that I had held was questioned. Anyway, at the end of the year, it was a very tough year. I felt like I was in a battle situation all year long. But at the end of the year, I felt very liberated because I felt that everything, all the cobwebs had been blown out of my head, and I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted to do. You see, and I knew I was a Muslim woman and I wanted to do my theology from within the Islamic world. To hell with the Divinity School. Doesn't matter. That's who I was. So I found my way. And after that, I never looked back. I think that was really the ordeal by fire that I went through that year. Okay. Now I want to take you to another place. That is in the 1990s. Now, this was the decade of the World Conferences, which have had a tremendous impact on the position of women globally. I had the privilege of being at Cairo conference, and with Rosemary, we were roommates actually at that conference. And this was, for me, a tremendous break. This conference was a great breakthrough for women. The real issue that was being debated at the Cairo conference was not just family planning and birth and abortion, etc. The real issue that was being debated at the Cairo conference was who owns women's bodies. Is it the church, the state, the community, men, who? Because never before has the answer been given that women own their bodies. And so anyhow, but the most important thing for me that happened at the Cairo conference was that the answer that came from all kinds of women, religious, non-religious, across the spectrum, all religions, very strong, resounding answer that came from that conference was, we own our bodies. And the majority of these women who said this were Muslim, because this was Cairo, which is one of the great Muslim capitals of the world. And I felt very, very encouraged. I felt, well, this is wonderful. After all these centuries, we've got our bodies back. I mean, because as dualism has affected all our traditions, women have always been seen as bodies. Men were rational, men were logos, reason, spirit, women were gross physical matter, but they were not seen as owners of their body until 1994. As far as I'm concerned. And I said, well, maybe next year we'll get back the rest of us, at Beijing. But at Beijing, what happened was there was a total backlash. The most massive presence at the Beijing conference was that of Muslim women dressed in black, covered from head to foot, supported by a lot of men and who had a lot of literature. One of the things that they were distributing was a big poster of a woman all covered in black and saying, Islam is my religion and hijab this is my dress, meaning if you don't dress this way, you're not a Muslim woman. Okay. Now, I want to share with you my perception of the discourse that happened at that level between these two groups of women, because that's exactly what's happening throughout the Muslim world today. It's the same thing. Okay. There are two groups of women that are very visible and very vocal. And this was the same as Beijing. And I want to represent to you what I consider to be their position. What are they saying? The first one, this group, women in black, extreme religious right group. What they're saying, they're taking a party line position. What they are saying is the following. Islam is a wonderful religion. It gives us all the rights that we want. It treats us like princesses and queens. We have no problems. We have no obligation to work. We are taken care of. What business is it of the United Nations, which is a secular institution, to interfere in our affairs? And who are these Western feminists? Most of them are lesbians anyway. They are just very jealous of us. Let them not interfere in our affairs. Now, this is their position. I have two serious problems with this position. The first one is this, that I also, as a believing Muslim, think Islam is a wonderful religion. My question is, where is it practiced? The second is that the vast majority of Muslim women are certainly not treated like princesses and queens. The last 3 years, particularly when I have been very much involved with looking at the whole issue of women, of violence against women, to have discovered the horrendous crimes that are being committed against women in the Muslim world. And so I can't accept this position. Now, there's another group, and I don't know what to call this group because it doesn't have a name. They call themselves all sorts of things, human rights activists, secular humanists, etc. It doesn't matter what they call themselves. It's important to understand their position, however. They start by making a statement that religion and human rights are incompatible, and Anne referred to that in her opening statement yesterday in some context. This is, of course, the line of the UN itself. Because when the UN was created in 1948 against a backdrop of great conflict, it wanted to stay away from anything that it saw as a source of potential conflict, and religion was certainly top of the list. So UN documents don't want to talk about religion. Then they go on to say, and Islam is the most anti-humanistic, most misogynistic of all religions, so we cannot talk about women's rights in the context of Islam. Now, my problem with this group is also on two accounts. One is that, having spent so much of my life studying the Quran, I know that every single human right that exists, from the right to life to the right to freedom, to right to work, to right to justice, any human right that you can mention, I'll give you the chapter and verse in the Quran which supports that right. So this is simply not the case, that the Quran doesn't support human rights. Secondly, and this is a very important point to me personally, it's a pragmatic point. I have been doing this thing for the last 30 years, traveling from one end of the Muslim world to the other, trying to educate Muslim women about their rights, etc. Why? Because I am very concerned to reach that woman who lives in some village, who's poor, who's illiterate, who lives in a village. These are the three characteristics of the average Muslim woman. She's poor, she is illiterate, and lives in a village. I say to her, do you believe in God? And of course she does. God is what gives sense to her life. It's the sustaining force in her life. Do you believe that God is merciful and just? And she does, and that's rather strange, because her own life is so full of injustice and oppression, and yet she believes that God is merciful and just. Do you believe that this God wants you to have no rights, that you should be beaten, that you should be brutalized, that you should die in childbirth? Now, this is very simple theology, but it makes sense to her. And she begins to realize that this religion, which has always been the sustaining force in her life, but has also been a constraining factor, can, in fact, become a means of her liberation. And so a light goes on in her eyes, and she begins then to fight for her rights. I think this is an extremely important point that needs to be understood, that in the contemporary Islamic world, the only way that Muslim women are going to get their rights are if they work within the framework of Islam. I can't stress this strongly enough, that this is the only way. And I'll come back to this if I have a few minutes when I try to contextualize what's happening in the U.S. today. Okay. Okay. I have a few minutes? I don't have. Okay. Well, can I have 5 more minutes? Thank you. All right. Okay. Anyway, thank you. Okay, so I've talked to you about the two extreme positions. What I want to point out is that the vast majority of the Muslims, over 90%, are in the middle. These are people who are moderate. These are people who who believe in human rights, who want to be modern, who want to be successful. They have a very strong faith in God. No matter how they practice Islam, they don't practice everything. They don't all pray 5 times a day. They don't all fast. But they have a strong Islamic identity and a strong faith in whatever they call the Islamic value system. Now, it's these people, it's the moderate people, what President Musharraf calls the silent majority. The challenge in the Muslim world is how to mobilize these people. Because in this war against terrorism, extremism, the only hope we have of winning this war is if the people in the middle get stronger and become vocal and take charge of things. You cannot go into a country from outside and pluck out the extremists, because you take out 10 and you will have 1,000 more. So I think this is very, very important in terms of trying to develop a strategy, that it is the people in the middle. And the vast majority of these people, Muslims, etc., are moderate people. This is the evil role that has been played since 9/11 by the primetime television media has been to totally block out the existence of these people. I mean, I'm asked all the time by people, where are the moderate Muslims? And I said, well, you're looking at one. But see, we have become totally invisible. Nobody wants to hear us. Nobody wants to know what we think, because that shatters the stereotype of what a Muslim is supposed to be. Anyway. Okay, well, because, I'm running out of time, I can't really say very much more. I have been very much involved in developing institutions. I initiated an organization called the International Network for the Rights of Female Victims of Violence in Pakistan, which has been very much engaged in focusing on honor killings, honor crimes, and looking at the root causes. Why are women in the Muslim world treated the way they are? What are the root causes, religious, cultural, etc.? Very recently, in fact, only a month ago, we have been able to initiate a wonderful organization called WEB, Women Engaging in Bridge Building, which is basically European-based. And it is a group of women who came together last year and was interested in doing bridge building between Muslims and non-Muslims, focusing very much on the issue of women. Now, in terms of U.S. policy, again, there's so many aspects of it. But one thing I want to say is that, there has been a lot of focus on the issue of women in the context of the Afghan war. Between September and December, on the face of every magazine cover of every magazine was the face of an Afghan woman, a Muslim woman. And in her radio address, Mrs. Bush said in November, we have liberated the women of Afghanistan, and now we should celebrate, etc. And I wanted to say to her, where were you 5 years ago, Mrs. Bush? The Americans did not go into Afghanistan to liberate the women. I wish they had. But we go to different countries to get oil, not to liberate women. Women are not important enough in any context. And then the discussion subsequently, and I've been involved in a lot of high-level discussions on what is the role of women in post-Taliban Afghanistan. And the role of some of the feminist groups here that have been very strongly supportive of Afghan women. The position is as follows. Now we have liberated them, they will throw off their burqa, then they will throw off their Afghan identity and then their Islamic identity, and quote, unquote, they will become secular just like us. This is a form of feminist imperialism. And this we need to watch out for this. Afghan women and Muslim women need the help of all of you, but they need to be helped practically. It's not with strings tied. It's not like, we will give you money so that you become just like us. So I think that's a huge challenge. And I feel that there are days that I feel really, really depressed because, especially after talking to policymakers in this country, because I believe that there is such a strong prejudice against Islam in this country that there is no willingness to accept that Islam can be the frame for any kind of reconstruction. And there is this tussle going on. We want to democratize society, which doesn't mean democratize, it means de-Islamize these societies. I think that's a very dangerous trend, and we need to know where this is going. Now, I'm totally out of time, but I want to take a minute to read to you a short poem that I wrote. Now, this is on behalf of all women, and I particularly want to dedicate it to the wonderful women that I personally know in this audience. Many of them, I can't even name all of them. It's called I Am a Woman. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman who, like Othello, loved not wisely but too well. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman living in a world in which the rules are made by men and where men can break all the rules and yet be gods, saviors and saints, martyrs and heroes, but where if women break the rules made by men, broken by men, they cannot live without being shamed, slandered and abused, beaten and hurt, scourged and stoned, burned and buried, alive and damned. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, born to love, living in a world in which when men love, they are called princes and knights, poets and mystics, or at the worst, perhaps lunatics. But when women love, then women becomes a mortal sin, for which they must give up their life. For when a woman is guilty of a mortal sin, the sin of loving, then she must die, so that the jealous God of love may be at peace. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, living in a world in which there are a number of men and also some women who cannot love. And since love is what makes us human and gives us life, these men and women are callous and cold, cruel and cowardly, though they wear the masks of sages and madonnas and cherubs. And they are always ready to strike my eternal heart, because I dare to live and love. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman who has endured so many births and so many deaths, so that the seed of life and love may not be destroyed by those who, in the name of God of love, who does not love, want to create a loveless world, a lifeless world, full of tombs, where one cannot hear the sound of life, the laughter of a little child, warm from the womb, who wants to live, who wants to love, and to whom an eternal-hearted woman is what God should be. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, the bearer of life, the nurturer of life, the protector of life. I can give life because I'm not afraid of pain, for I know that love is always pain. Even joyful love is ringed with pain. And no one can love who cannot embrace with heart and soul the pain of living, the pain of loving. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, and I can suffer again and again the pain of loving men and women who do not love, who will tear my heart and soul to little shreds, and who will put my life-carrying body upon death's bed in order to placate a God who says he is the God of love, but who abhors both life and love, and who demands a sacrifice, my sacrifice, and says that I must slaughtered be, just like an animal, helpless and trapped, whose blood is spilled so that the sins of those who kill may be forgiven. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, and though I may be tormented and abandoned, dishonored and disowned, scourged and flogged, stoned and burned and buried alive, I will never be a martyr. I will never be a victim. I will never be a loser. I will always be a survivor. I will always be a winner. I will always be triumphant. For though I go, I will return, and though I die, I will live again forever and forever. For I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, and since my heart is made of love, and love is eternal, embodied in creation, leading to resurrection, though all else will burn with the funeral pyre, in the flames of the fire, my eternal heart will never to ashes turn. And like a phoenix, I will rise again. And like a phoenix, I will be reborn. Thank you.